The first truck backed up to the fence line on the last Tuesday of September 1981 and tipped 7 tons of apple pomace onto the ground behind Harmon Vandermeer's barn. It came off the bed in one slow brown gold avalanche, wet and steaming faintly in the morning cold, smelling of bruised fruit and yeast, and something underneath that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. A second load came Thursday, a third the following Monday, and by the middle of October, the trucks from the Bramer Valley Juice Company were running twice a week, spreading a low ridge of crushed apple skins and seeds, and stems along the back edge of his 47 acres like a levee, built out of everything the pressing floor didn't want. Harmon stood at the gate most mornings and watched a thermos cup in one hand, saying nothing. He was 61 years old, a widower 3 years running, and the neighbors along Hasenberg Ridge had stopped remarking on the trucks by the third week. To them it was simple arithmetic. The juice plant pressed 400 tons of apples a week in season, and close to a third of every apple comes out the other side of the press as pomace. And the hog farmer who used to haul it away had retired, and the county landfill had started charging by the ton. Somebody's back 40 was going to catch it. Vandermeers caught it. What nobody on the ridge could quite explain was why he'd agreed. His late wife's nephew, Garrett Schapp, drove the dump route for the plant, and when Garrett had come by in September, cap in his hands, working his way toward the question the long way around, Harmon had said yes before the boy finished the sentence. No fee, no conditions, not even a shrug. People decided it was the tiredness of a man alone. Easier to let the trucks come than to make a fuss, easier than a phone call, easier than caring. A widower past 60 with an orchard going feral doesn't fight the world over a smell. But anyone who looked closely, and almost no one did, would have seen that he wasn't just tolerating the pomace. He was out there in the evenings after the trucks left, working the pile with a manure fork, pulling it into long, low windrows the way a man handles material, not garbage. He kept the fresh loads separate from the old ones. He covered one section with boards and left another open to the air, like a man running a comparison he hadn't admitted to. If you had leaned on the fence and asked him what he was doing back there, he would have looked at the windrows a while and told you the honest truth. He didn't entirely know yet. If you like stories where patience does most of the talking, this channel keeps them coming every week. Subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment telling me what state you're watching from tonight. Because half the pleasure of these stories is finding out how far they travel. Now, back to the trucks. Harmon hadn't farmed the place in earnest since Tressa died. She went upstairs to rest before supper on a Friday in October 1978 and did not come down. And after that, the orchard simply stopped mattering to him in the way a clock stops mattering to a man who has quit keeping appointments. His father had planted the first northern spy trees on that ground in 1938, 19 acres of them eventually. Spies and Jonathans and a stubborn double row of winesaps that ripened late and hung on through the first frosts. For 30 years, Harmon had run it the way ridge orchards were run, spraying and thinning and picking, hauling the fancy grades to the packing house and the rest to the cider mills. After Tressa, he sold the airblast sprayer to a man from 2 counties over, let the scab and the coddling moth take the fancy grades, and settled into selling drops and utility fruit to the juice plant for $57 a ton, which in a good year paid the taxes and in a bad year mostly did. He drove a school bus now, mornings and afternoons, Route 926 children, and 4 miles of washboard gravel, a job he'd taken the winter after the funeral because the house was too quiet between 6 and 8 in the morning, and the bus barn was not. He played Usher Thursday nights in the basement of the Reformed church in Voskuil, or he had until he stopped for a year. And then he started again, not for the cards, but because the coffee down there was easier to sit with than the coffee at home. His daughter Neleki called from Lansing every Sunday at 7. She asked if he was eating. He said yes. Some Sundays it was even true. The orchard went on without him the way orchards do, blooming extravagantly every May for nobody, dropping fruit every fall that he sold by the ton without ever tasting. He kept the grass mowed between the rows because his father had kept it mowed. And that was the extent of his farming. 47 acres, 19 of them in trees his family had pruned for 2 generations. And the most alive thing on the place was a pile of another company's garbage steaming behind the barn. The Pomace changed something in him, though he could not have said what. And he was not a man who went looking for words like that anyway. Maybe it was the sheer scale of the waste. Tons of it a week. The crushed remains of fruit his own tree's cousins had grown, treated as a disposal problem by men who measured apples in gallons of juice and nothing else. Maybe it was only that it gave his hands a question to work on. His hands had been out of questions for 3 years. He remembered his mother 50 years back, in the kitchen of this same house, and the crock she kept on the floor behind the woodstove. This was 1933, the bottom of the hard years, when the fruit money came in nickels, and his father took relief work on the county roads 2 winters running. Harmon Vandermeer kept a vinegar crock the way other women kept a sourdough sponge, fed and skimmed and guarded. Into it went windfall cider, peelings, cores, the sweet water she rinsed the apple butter kettle with, anything with sugar left in it. On top of it floated a thing Harmon had been half afraid of as a boy, a slick gray-brown mat like a wet leather pancake. And when he asked what it was, she told him it was the mother, and that the mother did all the work, and that his only job was to keep from disturbing her. The kitchen smelled sharp all winter. When the lid came off the crock, the smell could make a boy's eyes water from 4 feet away. She traded that vinegar all through the worst of it. Quart jars went out the kitchen door and came back as eggs, as a spool of thread, as a resold boot, once as a live hen with her feet tied that Harmon carried home under his arm like a parcel. Storekeepers in town sold white vinegar for pennies. But the women on the ridge wanted alchies, for pickling and for medicine, and for reasons Harmon suspected were partly just the visiting that came with the jar. She had a saying she used on him when he complained about hauling peelings, and it came back to him whole the first evening. He stood at the edge of the dumped Pomace with a fork in his hands 50 years, and 1 month later. Sweet spoils, Jongen. Sour keeps. October makes cider all by itself, she used to say. The trick is being worth something in March. He hadn't thought about the crock in decades. He had no idea, that first October, that there was a name for the leather pancake, or a science under his mother's rules, or a reason the crock lived behind the stove and not in the cold pantry. He just knew that a river of crushed apples was being poured out on his ground twice a week, and that somewhere in the back of his skull, a woman with her sleeves rolled was telling him it was worth something. His first discovery was how fast the pile could go wrong. Fresh Pomace is wet, sweet, and alive, and a heap of it the size of a pickup truck starts to heat inside a day, the wild yeasts on the skins going to work whether anyone invites them or not. For a day or two, a fresh load smelled like the inside of a cider mill, sweet and bright. By the 4th day, it smelled like beer left open. By the 7th, in warm weather, the middle of an unturned pile went slick and gray and gave off a stink that drifted a 1/4 mile down the ridge when the wind was wrong, and the fruit flies rose off it in columns that turned gold when the evening sun came through them. Harmon learned to work a load within 2 days or lose it. The neighbors, watching him fork garbage into tidy windrows in the dusk, arrived at their own explanations. None of them generous, all of them polite enough to stay unspoken. It was around then that the men at the church started calling the back of his place the Sour Patch. Nobody said it to him directly. Voskuil was not a town that said things directly, but he heard it secondhand within the month, the way you hear everything on a ridge. And he noticed that he didn't mind it half as much as he was probably supposed to. Only one man brought it to the fence. Marvin Hoekstra ran 90 milking Holsteins on the next place east, downwind of Harmon's back 45 days out of 7. And one evening in that first November, he pulled his pickup onto the shoulder and sat with the engine running while Harmon worked the newest load. Hoekstra was not an unreasonable man. He was a man with a bulk tank inspector who walked his barnyard twice a month sniffing for anything that could taint milk, and he let the silence stretch a while before he spent any words on the situation. "Whatever the plant's paying you," he said finally, "I hope it covers what I'm smelling at my silo." Harmon leaned on the fork and told him the truth, that the plant was paying him nothing. Hoekstra looked at the windrows for a long moment and then at Harmon. And something in his face rearranged itself from irritation into a kind of wary bafflement, which on the ridge was worse. A man being paid to take garbage was a business arrangement. A man taking it for free was a question. He put the truck in gear and said, over the engine, that he guessed everybody grieved in their own way. Then he drove off, and Harmon stood in the cold, surprised by how much that one stung. The Pomace itself surprised him. He had assumed, the way everyone at the plant assumed, that pressed Pomace was spent, that the juice men had taken everything worth taking. His mother's voice argued otherwise, and one evening in the 2nd October he ran a test that settled it. He filled a washtub with fresh Pomace, covered it with well water, let it stand overnight, and in the morning pressed the soaked mash through the little rack and cloth hand press that had hung in the barn since his father's day. Oak frames and a great iron screw you turned with a wagon spoke. What came out was a thin, cloudy, pale gold liquid, tart and distinctly sweet. Pressed Pomace still holds close to a quarter of the apple's sugar. Trapped in skins and cell walls, the first pressing couldn't break, and country people a century earlier had known it well enough to give the second pressing drink its own name. They called it ciderkin, and they made it every fall, a weak, cheap cider for children and hired men, proof that an apple gives up its value in installments to anyone willing to press twice. Harmon didn't know the word yet. He just knew the juice plant was paying to throw away sugar, and that sugar, his mother's arithmetic said, was the raw beginning of sour. What he did next was reasonable, and it was also the first of his failures, and the two facts took him a long time to untangle. He filled 3 50-gallon oak barrels with ciderkin that fall, barrels he'd bought for $8 apiece, years back at the auction when the old viscering mill down the road shut its doors for good. He let the wild yeast take the sweet liquid the way it wanted to. Listened to the barrels tick and sigh through November as the fermentation worked. And then, reasoning that a clean product wanted protection from the air, he drove the bungs in tight and left the barrels to become vinegar over the winter. It was the kind of logic that works for almost everything else a farm puts in a barrel. In April, he drilled a bung, drew a cupful, and tasted hard cider, flat, yeasty, sour-ish in the way of old beer, and not vinegar at all. He tried the second barrel in June, the third in August. Nothing in them had moved. He had made 150 gallons of something nobody wanted, sealed against the one ingredient it was waiting for. And he spent a good part of that summer quietly convinced that his mother's crock had been a knack that died with her. The truth, which he would not fully understand for another year, is that vinegar is not one fermentation, but two, run by two different workforces with opposite demands. The first is the one every farmer knows. Yeast eats sugar and makes alcohol, and it does its best work shut away from the air, down in the liquid, which is why cider and wine are made in closed vessels. The second is the one Alch's crock had been quietly demonstrating behind the stove for years. A family of bacteria called Acetobacter eats that alcohol and turns it to acetic acid, and it can only do this breathing, at the surface where liquid meets air. It builds itself a raft of cellulose to live on while it works, and that raft is the mother, the leather pancake, the thing a boy had been told never to disturb. Seal a barrel and the yeast finishes and the Acetobacter suffocates and everything stops, half transformed. Vinegar wants what almost nothing else in a cellar wants: a wide surface, open air and time. Harmon got his first hint of this by accident, and he very nearly threw it away. Late that second summer, out of some mix of stubbornness and disgust with the sealed barrels, he had set 3 open crocks of ciderkin on the shed floor, with cheesecloth tied over the tops, mostly to see what would happen. What happened by September looked like ruin. A skin formed on each crock, wrinkled and grayish white, and the smell coming up through the cheesecloth was sharp enough to sting. He was certain it was mold. He carried the first crock out and dumped it in the weeds, and the second, and he had the third at the door of the shed, resting on his knee while he caught his breath, when the lantern light fell across the surface at an angle and something stopped him. The skin on this one was different, not fuzzy, not white, but smooth, translucent, faintly amber at the edges, lying on the liquid like something laid there on purpose. He stood in the doorway a long moment, the crock against his leg, moths ticking against the lantern glass, an old man holding 30 pounds of stink and trying to remember exactly what the surface of his mother's crock had looked like when he was 12. Then he set it back down inside. He dipped a spoon through the skin the way he'd once seen her do it, from the edge, gently, and tasted underneath. It was rough, and it was young, and there was no mistaking what it was becoming. It was vinegar. 1 crock out of 3, and he'd carried the other 2 to the weeds with his own hands. And he had no idea yet which detail had made the difference. But standing in the lantern light with that spoon, Harmon Vandermeer felt something wake up in him that had been asleep since a Friday evening in October of 1978. And he was honest enough with himself to notice it. That Sunday at 7, Nellie called from Lansing the way she always did, and he told her about the school bus and the Uyghur standings and the weather coming down off the lake. And he did not mention that there was a crock of souring cider sitting behind the stove in her grandmother's spot, or that he had been reading the surface of it every morning by lamplight like a man checking a fever. It wasn't secrecy exactly. It was the same instinct that had kept him from explaining the windrows to Hoekstra. The thing was too young to survive being talked about. She asked if he was eating. He looked at the pot of hotspot on the back burner, 3 days old and better for it, and said yes, and for once the yes covered everything. He wintered that crock in the kitchen, behind the stove, in the exact spot he remembered, because he had no better theory than his mother's floor plan. The barrels he was less careful with, and January of 1983 taught him the cost of it. A cold snap took the ridge down to 14 below. The unheated shed went with it, and the 2 sealed barrels he'd left standing froze solid enough to shove their staves apart at the seams. He found them on a Saturday morning, hoops sprung, a low fan of amber ice spreading across the shed floor. A winter's work turned to a sculpture of exactly what he didn't know yet. He stood there in his own breath smoke for a while, doing the quiet arithmetic of a man discovering the size of his ignorance. Then he went to the house, got a coffee, came back, and started chipping the ice loose, because whatever else was true, the shed needed the floor. 2 things were coming toward him that winter, though he couldn't see either one. The first was a retired county extension agent named Lenore Dykuis, who knew precisely why 2 crocks had failed and 1 had lived. The second was an envelope with the Bramer County seal on it. Still 18 months away, that everyone on the ridge would call his bad luck, and that would turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to the Sour Patch. Lenore Dykuis found him in April of 1983, which is to say she drove up his lane one Saturday morning uninvited, parked her Fairmont wagon next to the shed, and stood looking at the split barrels he still hadn't hauled out. She was 66, widowed longer than he had been, and she had spent 31 years as a county extension agent, answering the questions farmers were too proud to ask out loud. Retirement had not improved her patience for wasted effort. Word of the Sour Patch had reached her, the way everything reached her, through the church basement and the feed mill counter, arriving as comedy, an old widower on the ridge, forking cannery garbage into rows and freezing barrels of who knew what. She had heard one detail in the telling that nobody else had thought was the important one. The crock behind the stove. She asked to see it. He showed her, and she stood over it a while with her reading glasses down her nose. And then she dipped a clean spoon at the edge the same way his mother used to, tasted, and made a small sound that Harmon would learn to treasure, because she made it rarely. Then she told him what he had. The smooth amber raft on his crock was a true Vinegar mother, a working colony, and by luck or inheritance it was a strong one. The wrinkled, dusty films on the 2 crocks he dumped in the weeds had almost certainly been calm, a harmless wild yeast that shows up on any ferment too cool or too weak to defend itself, ugly but survivable, and he had thrown away 2 crocks that mostly needed warmth and time. The kitchen crock had thrived for the same reason his mother kept hers behind the stove. The bacteria that make vinegar work best around 80 degrees, and a Michigan kitchen in winter has exactly one spot that holds 80 degrees. and Altje Vandermeer had known it without owning a thermometer. "You're not cooking, Mr. Vandermeer." Lenore told him that first morning. "You're keeping stock, smallest herd in the county, and it still wants what any herd wants: feed, air, and a warm barn." He didn't fully understand that either, the first time, but he was better at filing things away than he used to be. Under her direction, the operation stopped being an argument with luck. She taught him the old Orleans method, the way the vinegar houses of France had done it for 3 centuries. Barrels laid on their sides and filled only 2/3 full, bung holes left open and screened against flies, so that the liquid inside offered the widest possible surface to the air while the oak held the temperature steady. Fresh ciderkin went in at one end of the process, finished vinegar was drawn off at the other, and a portion of every barrel stayed behind with its mother to seed the next filling. The way a sourdough is never used up, only continued. Slow vinegar made this way keeps what fast vinegar loses. The quick industrial generators can turn alcohol to acid in a day, but they strip out the apple as they go, and what's left is acid and nothing else. An Orleans barrel takes 3 months and hands back everything the fruit brought with it: the malic tartness, the esters, the faint bitter note of seed and skin, so that the finished vinegar tastes like the orchard it came from, instead of like a chemistry problem. Harmon's vinegar, when it finally came right in the spring of 1984, tasted like northern spies and oak and patience. Lenore tried the first proper draw, made the small sound twice, and told him it was too good to be legal, which turned out to be a joke with a delayed fuse. Because in July of 1984, in the middle of a heat wave that sat on the ridge for the better part of 2 weeks, the envelope came. The heat had made everything worse behind the barn. The plant was running early-season transparents through the press. The loads were coming wetter than usual. And even with Harmon working the windrows every evening, the flies rose in their gold columns and the smell drifted east on the afternoon wind, straight across Marvin Hoekstra's barnyard, where a bulk tank inspector was due any week. Harmon never did learn for certain who made the call, and he decided early that he was better off not knowing. The envelope carried the Bramer County seal and a paragraph of language about odor nuisance and unpermitted waste disposal, and a scheduled site visit. And Harmon read it twice on the porch and felt the particular cold that comes to a man who has finally built something and can now see the shape of losing it. The sanitarian's name was Roy Kettner, a thick, deliberate man in his 40s, who arrived on the appointed morning expecting a garbage complaint and walked the property for an hour, finding something he didn't have a form for. The raw pomace was a problem, he said plainly. Stockpiled fruit waste in July was a nuisance under the code no matter how neatly a man forked it, and the plant would have to stop dumping on open ground, period. But then he stood in the shed a long while, looking down the row of barrels lying on their racks with their screened bungs breathing, and the crocks, and the jars of samples ranked on the windowsill, with dates grease penciled on the glass, and he asked what all this was. Harmon told him. Kettner pulled the screen off one bung, dipped a finger, and tasted, and there was a moment, 5 seconds maybe, where the county and the Sour Patch just looked at each other. "That's vinegar," Kettner said at last, in the tone of a man ruling out other possibilities. Harmon allowed that it was. "Then," said Kettner, "you've got a different problem than the one I drove out here for." The different problem was this. The moment Harmon sold a single bottle, he was a food processor, and a food processor needed a licensed facility, washable surfaces, potable water on tap, concrete underfoot, drains, and vinegar that tested at 4% acidity or better, because federal standards had said so since before the war, and no shed floor and kitchen stove was ever going to pass. Kettner laid it out without cruelty, item by item, the way a man reads a bill of materials, and later Harmon would understand that the sanitarian had been doing him a favor in the only language the county spoke. He wasn't saying stop. He was saying here is exactly what it takes. Harmon spent 2 evenings with a tablet and a pencil, and on the 3rd he drove down the road to see the Vissering Estates lawyer. The old cider mill had stood empty since 1963, but it had been built for exactly one purpose, and its bones remembered. Poured concrete floors with drains down the center, a drilled well, a pressing room with high windows and a cold room off the back, and a loading door sized for wagons that fit a pickup fine. The estate, which had been paying taxes on a memory for 20 years, rented it to him for $75 a month and looked grateful. Jarrett and 2 men from the church helped him move the barrels on a Saturday in October of 1984. And Lenore stood in the pressing room, directing traffic like the county fair superintendent she had once actually been. And when the last barrel was racked, she looked around the room and said that the building had waited 21 years for somebody to apologize to it. The move fixed the smell almost as an afterthought, and the fix had a shape nobody predicted. Fresh pomace now went straight from the plant's trucks to the mill's pressing room floor and through the press within a day. No more open stockpiles, no more gold columns of flies. And the spent, twice-pressed pomace, dry as sawdust by comparison, went out the loading door into the one truck on the ridge Harmon would never have guessed. Dried apple pomace, it turns out, is decent cattle feed, sweet enough that heifers push each other for it, and dairymen had been buying it sent from mills since his father's day. Marvin Hoekstra backed up to the loading door for the first time in November of 1984. Let the silence stretch the way he did, and then said that he'd take the loads regular, and that between the smell being gone and the heifers being happy, he supposed the ridge could stand to have one strange man on it. It was not an apology. On the ridge it was better than one. It was an account settled. The license came through in the spring of 1985, after an inspection in which Kettner ran his finger along the racked barrels like a man checking dust and found nothing to write down. That September, Harmon carried 12 cases to the Saturday farmers market in Voskuil, quart jugs at $2.75 and pints at $1.60, hand-labeled in Nellike's block printing because his own hand shook too much for labels. He set out a saucer of bread cubes and a bowl of his vinegar beside them, feeling like a fool, and stood behind the borrowed table in his church coat. A woman he half knew from the next township tried a cube, stood still a second, and called her sister over without ever quite taking her eyes off the bowl. By a little after noon, he had sold every jug and most of the pints. And a man he'd never met asked whether he took orders, and Harmon, 65 years old, heard himself say that he did. Nellie came home that Christmas and asked to see the mill. And Harmon walked her through it on a gray afternoon, with the barrels ticking softly in the cold, the way oak does when the temperature moves. She read the grease-penciled dates on the sample jars, and touched the labels printed in her own block hand. And then she stopped at the shelf by the pressing room window where he kept, retired now and empty, the crock from behind the stove. She knew it. She had grown up stubbing her toe on it. She stood there a while with her coat still buttoned, and when she turned around her face was doing something complicated. And she said, "Dad, this is Oma's." And he said that it was, and that in a manner of speaking so was all the rest of it. On the Sunday calls after that, she stopped asking whether he was eating, and started asking how the barrels were coming. And Harmon found that this was a better question to live inside of. The failures did not stop coming just because the money started. In the summer of 1986, trying to speed a slow barrel, he rigged an aquarium pump to bubble air through it, reasoning that if the bacteria wanted oxygen, he would give them plenty. Lenore was out of town. In 9 days, the barrel went from nearly finished to thin and watery, and it took her one sniff on her return to tell him what he'd done. Acidobacter is loyal only as long as the alcohol lasts. Give the herd unlimited air after the feed runs out, and it will turn and eat the very acid it made, burning vinegar back down toward water, which is why the old method rations air by patience instead of pump. He poured $190 worth of near vinegar into the drain that week, and never hurried a barrel again. The next spring, a chef named Corinne Fassbender, who ran a white tablecloth room in the city an hour south, tasted his vinegar on somebody else's salad, drove up unannounced exactly the way Lenore once had, and left with 3 cases and a standing monthly order, the first of 6 restaurants that would find the mill by word of mouth over the next 2 years. The mail did the rest. In the fall of 1987, he paid for a 3-line classified in a farm monthly, half expecting nothing, and the orders came back in envelopes from 13 states, some for jugs, and a surprising number for something he'd only offered as an afterthought. Starter mothers, cut from his barrels, packed in pint jars of their own vinegar for farm wives and back to the landers who wanted the herd, not just the milk. Every mother that left the mill was a piece of the same colony that had survived the weeds, the freeze, and the county. And some part of Harmon liked knowing that his mother's crock was quietly recolonizing kitchens he would never see. Jarrett came on for weekends year-round now, and 2 church women worked the bottling table in season. And when Harmon's accountant closed the books that winter of 1988, the Sour Patch had grossed $111,000, 7 years and 3 months after the first truck tipped its load, and not $1 of it from anything the juice plant had ever thought was worth keeping. The plant still presses 400 tons a week in season, and the trucks still run twice a week, only now they turn in at the old mill's loading door, instead of the open ground behind the barn. What comes off the trucks hasn't changed at all. The only thing that changed on Hazenberg Ridge was the man standing at the other end of the load, and what he'd decided it was. At the Voskuil Harvest Festival in October of 1989, the Reformed Church ran a tasting table for the town's own products, and Harmon's jugs stood between the honey and the banquet, and people who had called it the Sour Patch for 8 years said the words now the way you'd say the name of a ball team. Hoekstra came by late in the afternoon, studied the table, and told Harmon to sell him 2 quarts, and they'd call the smell even, and paid full price, which everyone present understood to be the speech of a lifetime. Lenore, 72 that fall, took her taste of the new season's first draw from a spoon, closed her eyes a moment with the crowd noise going on around her, and made the small sound. Then she looked at Harmon over her glasses and told him the herd was thriving. He thought of a woman with her sleeves rolled, feeding a crock behind a woodstove in the worst winter of the hard years, trading sour for eggs and thread and company, worth something in March. It had taken him 56 years to finish hearing the sentence. I keep coming back to the part of this story where he almost dumped the 3rd crock. He was one tired evening away from carrying the whole future out to the weeds, and what stopped him wasn't knowledge, because he didn't have any yet. It was the willingness to stand still in a doorway and look a second time at something everyone else had already named garbage. Most of us inherit more than we think we do, and most of it doesn't look like money. It looks like a smell from an old kitchen, a sentence we didn't understand at 12, a patience we watched somebody practice. The inheritance isn't the vinegar. It's the second look. This story is true to life fiction, inspired by the kind of stories rural America remembers. All characters, names, businesses, and places are creative inventions, and any resemblance to real persons or establishments is coincidental.